Think Tent. I think it might be the last event of Think Tent 2023. So we're in good company. And a very important question for a group like the Taxpayers Alliance that talks about, tax cuts and tax simplification. We have to think about the other side of the ledger as well, and public spending. And is it a good time for the Conservatives to be talking about spending restraint with an election looming? Of course, it's very easy for any politician to go onto the radio or to the TV and talk about, yes, we're going to spend more money, and Nick Robinson will say, what's the government going to do about this? And yes, we're going to spend more money. But actually, maybe it's time to start talking about something different so that we can start to talk about tax cuts and introduce growth. So we've got a great panel to discuss this. We have Ben Hopkinson, a policy researcher at Britain Remade, Alice Denby, who's the editor of CapX, John Glenn, MP, who of course is the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, and Matthew Lynn, who's a columnist at the Daily Telegraph. So I'll probably just keep this traditional, pass along the panel in the usual way, and then we'll open up to hopefully robust discussion from the floor. So Matthew, we're going to start with you. Why don't you address the essay question?
Thank you very much, John. I would say when I saw it on the invite, I was thinking it must be from the Taxpayers Alliance. I thought it must be a trick question. Should the Conservative Party show spending restraint? I was trying to work out what the angle is. I think the answer to that one is obviously yes. I think in the last 5 years, possibly longer, the Conservative Party's been a tax and spend party. We could all discuss the reasons for that, but it's tested to destruction. The idea that whatever the answer to Britain's problems is, it's more public spending. And admittedly, the Labour Party is about to test it to whatever the next level up from destruction is. But we'll put that to one side. I just think actually the interesting question, once you say that it's yes, that it should show spending restraint, and there's absolutely no point at the current state of affairs in a kind of pre-election giveaway. We're lucky to have John here. Tell us if he's going to do it, but probably not. It's actually the really interesting question is going to be, how do you make the argument for controlling public spending and then eventually cutting public spending? And I think that's going to come in three parts. I think the first thing is to start recognizing that you're losing the argument, that the last 5 to 10 years, the people who believe in a smaller state, the people who believe that public spending isn't the answer to everything, have been losing the argument. So we need to start being honest about that and thinking more seriously about how we win the argument, particularly amongst younger people. I think the second thing we need to do is start talking about the size of the state. You can't control public spending without having a conversation about the size of the state, and we can get on to that longer. And I think you've also got to talk about how you re-engineer the state so that you can actually deliver lower, more effective public spending at lower cost. Those would be my 3 points to initiate.
So, given the Americans are obviously, they've got the Inflation Reduction Act, a huge amount of subsidy, industrial policy. The European Union are going to respond in some way. Is a smaller state even realistic in this sort of slightly different world that maybe we had 10 years ago?
Yeah, absolutely. From my perspective, and we could discuss it. I think actually the Inflation Reduction Act is going to prove a catastrophe. I think it's very easy to spend money. And as we know from history, the first couple of years when you borrow tons of money and spend it, and you give it away like crazy to lots of companies, is quite good. And then year 3 and 4 gets very difficult, and year 5 gets extremely difficult. So I think actually, there's going to be with the United States and the European Union very much committed to a bigger state model, to more industrial activism. There's going to be a good space for the UK for actually taking it's going in a slightly different direction. And it's going to be an excellent space for having a slightly smaller state, slightly lower tax economy. And it won't have to be too dramatic. Actually just, cutting taxes a tiny little bit and cutting debt a tiny little bit over the next 10 years, given what our competitors are doing, will be extremely good.
And do you have a preferable tax cut, or Lord Frost had an article recently in the Telegraph about kind of doesn't matter what the tax cut is, we just got to start cutting taxes in order to reduce the tax burden overall, and that's the most important thing. Or do you take a more strategic approach, and actually, there are certain tax cuts that we should focus on?
No, it's one of your favourite questions. One of your favourite questions, John. I think nearly all tax cuts are beneficial. I think my answer to that would be probably for the economy, the best one would be reversing the rise in corporation tax. I think the rise in corporation tax was a big mistake, and I think over the next couple of 2 or 3 years, it will prove to be a big mistake in damaging our competitiveness. So I think in terms of the economy, I think that's the best one. In terms of the electorate inheritance tax, it doesn't actually have a huge impact on the economy, but it's the one that plays well with the electorate. So those would be my 2 priorities.
There we go. Okay, over to you, John.
Well, I think most of all, I mean, it's interesting. We're here to talk about spending, and straight away we're on tax.
I know, right?
I thought it was inevitable. Of course, we all believe in higher growth and low taxes, but we've also got to be real honest about where we spend money, why we spend money, and what we committed to in a manifesto around those expenditures. So, people say, well, the triple lock, I don't like the triple lock anymore. Well, it was in our manifesto. We sort of say, well, we spend too much on the NHS. Well, the NHS has, got significant waiting lists, consequential of what happened with COVID. It's 15% less effective. We've attended to the dentists and doctors pay review body recommendations, but we've still got challenges. If you think about defence, people say, well, we need to spend more money on defence. And we're going to get all of this if we just taxed a few things a little less. Our corporation tax is still the lowest in the G7 when you look at the full expensing for the next 3 years. And if we make that permanent, that gives us the joint most competitive in the OECD. I agree with Matthew with respect of the aspiration that people have to pay inheritance tax, and absolutely, we want to reduce taxes overall. But what I think we need is to answer the question that you've set, is actually say, let's make sure that what we do spend of taxpayers' money is spent wisely and effectively. And what I'm doing as Chief Secretary, as the Chancellor said in his speech yesterday, is a productivity review, which I recognise has happened before. But I think there are 3 key elements to it for me, which I think will give us the prospect of lowering that trajectory of growth in public expenditure, which you rightly say doesn't need to be lowered too much to have quite an effect over time. We have public servants who, by stealth over time, have done more and more administrative tasks that don't really add much value to their discharge of their responsibilities. And so I'm actively asking every Secretary of State to come forward with a plan on how we can reduce that admin time. So that means what forms that teachers are filling in, what things that police officers do that doesn't add anything materially to the discharge of their responsibilities, and actually then creates more forms for somebody else to process, to generate more policy, which doesn't add anything. So that's one area. Now, AI has massive transformational implications for our economy. So our economy generally, but in public sector quite directly. Now, if you think about the number of job centres that exist around this country and the mechanism by which work coaches and those that work in job centres go through, the processes they go through to match jobs, vacancies with individuals who are looking for a job, a lot of that can be done far more effectively using AI, and I recognise that is something that we need to do urgently. But also, the question we must be asking all the time is, what are the outcomes we get? I don't want the permanent secretaries and cabinet ministers saying that they've done well at a fiscal event if they've got more money from the Treasury. I want them to say they've done well if they've got about the same or a bit less, but can tell me that at the end of the scorecard period, they're going to deliver more of the outcomes that they're constituted to do. And so I think it's important that this party is actually honest with itself about what it wants to prioritise in terms of expenditure. Because I can tell you there is a bit of a disconnect between the enthusiasm for tax cuts and the willingness to come to terms with the hard decisions needed to reduce expenditure and do things differently, to cut out some activities as superfluous, to invest in ways of doing things differently, and to redesign the way that we do things so that we actually spend less money. But I have to say, that the country as a whole gets very anxious when you talk about cuts in expenditure, and they will look very closely at what we suggest at the autumn statement. And if that profile of the unprotected departments, when you take out defence and you take out health and you take out schools, looks like it's on a trajectory resembling what it was in 2010 to 2015, you will have Torsten Bell and you will have Paul Johnson saying, well, this resembles austerity. And we as a party need to be very clear that we are prepared to take decisions that allow us to have a more productive public estate, that does more for less and demands more efficiencies and actually challenges on that ever-growing public sector, which isn't always very effective. But when I go around conference every year, I get local authority leaders saying, well, we're going to go bust unless you give us more money. And I have, every cabinet minister, bar virtually none, who says, well, we need to deal with this pressure here. What we need as a party is to be honest about, the choices we've made, be real about the things that we're not going to do, and actually deliver a narrative that then justifies what we can do on the other side of the ledger. Because the truth is, we can all talk about tax cuts, but the therapeutic effect in terms of what will happen in year one in the run-up to an election, there's the political effect, and that is hotly contested, and then there's the reality in terms of the economic effect. And my view is that, yes, of course we need to win elections. No point being virtuous on paper if we don't win elections, but it needs more hard work on my side of the ledger as much as on the tax side, and that's what I'm gripped by and what I'm doing. And I'll say one final thing. I was 4.5 years the Economic Secretary, as some of you will know. And if I look at financial services, which is such an important industry in this country, gives us so much tax revenues, that's not really fortified by low taxes particularly. It's fortified by the right regulatory environment, the fact that you've brought all the right people together. Now, I'm not saying that the FCA and the PRA are beyond improvement. Of course, there are things that need to be done differently. But globally, they're very well respected, and that's why that industry has been very resilient after some of the doomsters who said that after Brexit it wouldn't be. It was, it is, and it will be, and it's not reliant on more money. It's reliant on strong regulation, access to capital, and playing to our core strengths. And to Matthew's point about the whole nature of the subsidy and IRA and how we compete with that, of course we can't compete with it. We're not going to be in the same size of ability to give bungs, and constitutionally, I don't personally feel very comfortable with that. But what I do think is we've got to say, well, where are our strengths? And we've got to avoid as a party, where we have been at some points in recent past, of being strong on the rhetoric and not very good at the reality of governing, which means hard choices, tough choices, and being honest with the electorate. And that will lead us to a better place than where we've been in the last few years.
Thank you, John. You're talking about the public spending and the potential to reduce public spending, and talking about the country as a whole being on board with it. And then you went on to mention the IFS and Torsten Bell. Do they represent the country? To what extent is there a disconnect between elite conversation on this, or however you want to phrase it, something less sort of jazzy, but that sort of Westminster conversation, how different is that from what the rest of the country think about these issues?
Well, I relish the challenge. What I'm telling you is what they will say, and I'm also telling you what we say in return, which is that let's not be bound by that conversation that says unless you're spending more, it's austerity and it's detrimental. What I'm trying to bring forward with work with my colleagues is actually a plan to say we can increase the productivity and efficiency of the public sector and make sure that taxpayers' money is spent more effectively, and we can deliver better outcomes. And it's not always conditional on spending more money. If you look at many parts of government and many, they are ripe for reform, radical reform, after a period of significant distress through COVID. And across all agencies of all departments, That is the shift that we're asking for. It won't happen by me declaring it. It'll be help with a plan over 3 or 4 years, sometimes needing some investment in year one, but that will give us the significant shift in the direction of travel, and that's what we should always be doing as Conservatives.
Okay. And just before I move on, abuse the position of chair quite a bit, but you mentioned you want to see different organisations in the public sector maybe celebrating the fact that they've got the same budget or a bit of a reduced budget. It's hard to imagine, sure, but how does one change the incentive structure? What actually has to happen for a public sector organisation to not celebrate that big budget?
Well, sometimes we've got to resist those sort of websites and so on that call out, high pay for individuals in the public sector if they're delivering better outcomes. Yeah. We need to have more flexibility. If you look at for example, defence procurement, where there's a massive asymmetry between the ability of industry to condition, how they negotiate a deal with government, because we haven't got always the right people on our side of the argument. So we've got to be real about what it takes to, actually deliver different outcomes and, get the best people in to do that. And also realise that, having more people isn't the same as having the most effective people to deliver change in public sector. So the Chancellor obviously set out yesterday, what he was saying in terms of the freeze on civil service. But what I want to see in that productivity review, which we'll bring forward at the autumn statement and will be the sort of precondition for it, is actually a plan of where we need to invest to bring things down significantly and where we can stop doing things that are unproductive.
Thank you, John. We'll go straight to Alice.
Thanks. Well, I feel like the obvious answer to the essay question of should Conservatives show spending restraint with an election looming is no. I mean, it's not going to make you popular. People don't like having things taken away from them. I think there was an opinion poll that's found that as less than 20% of people thought that public spending should be reduced, even if it was accompanied by tax cuts. So cutting spending right now is very unlikely to be politically expedient, but I would say that it is economically and morally necessary because, frankly, we're about to fall off a cliff. Spending on the over 65s is projected to increase by 11% of GDP by the 2070s. That's going to be £250 billion a year. Debt's going to be 267% of GDP in 50 years' time if spending continues on its current trajectories.
Not if I'm in office.
Well, I hope so. If servicing the national debt was a department in Whitehall, it would have a bigger budget than the NHS. And all of this is not kind of an active policy choices. This is just kind of sleepwalking onto a completely unsustainable path. And we have to change course. And I'm afraid I feel like I'm going to suggest some areas where I think we do need change, and it is the triple lock. The triple lock has increased pensions by 60% since it was introduced, which is 20 percentage points more than if it just risen by average earnings. And the real trouble with the triple lock is that it bakes in uncertainty about future levels of public spending into the system. It makes it harder for people to prepare for their own retirement and harder for the government to plan for the long term. I also think it's completely unacceptable to have a universal benefit that goes to the wealthiest pensioners as well as those who need it most. And pensioners, on the whole, are better off than younger generations. I mean, what is it? 1 in 5 pensioner households are millionaires. And we all know why pensioners get special treatment, and it's because they vote, and it's because older people tend to vote Tory. I think it's Frank Luntz who says that the average age of the Tory voter is deceased. So they're not a demographic. They're not a demographic that Conservatives can afford to lose. But I don't think you can run a society in the interests of the old. And also, I know that this is a Taxpayers Alliance an event, and I think even you guys agree that we do want to fund some public services, great schools, great healthcare. But there are plenty of things that the state does that it shouldn't. I mean, and John, you talked about the sort of pointless admin involved in some people's day-to-day jobs, but there are whole jobs just dedicated to that in the public sector, EDI jobs and so on, that are completely unnecessary. I think the government also funnels public money into charities and institutions that are fundamentally opposed to its agenda. So Conservative Way Forward have identified nearly £1 billion of public spending that was directed at charities that are actively hostile to government policy on issues like illegal migration and women's rights. I feel like there's just a real decadence and a lack of grip about that. One other thing that I feel especially passionate about myself is the costs of childcare in this country. And we have the most expensive childcare in the OECD. I know this personally. It's affected me. My daughter, before she started school, her nursery fees accounted for 70% of my post-tax earnings. And we have those huge upfront costs for consumers, despite spending £7 billion a year of taxpayers' money on subsidies for the childcare sector. And that bill is about to get even bigger because the government have announced a huge expansion of the so-called free childcare provision. In practice, that's just going to drive providers out of the sector because the government money doesn't cover their costs. And it also represents an enormous expansion of the state, effectively creating a kind of school system for the under fives. So instead, the government should be looking at regulatory burdens in the sector that are pushing up costs, like some of the highest adult-to-child ratios in Europe, and the early years foundation stage framework, which is effectively a curriculum for toddlers. And if you want to know how absurd that is, I was getting updates from my daughter's nursery when she was 2 on her literacy, when she couldn't read or reasonably be expected to because she was 2. The other thing, you guys at the TPA are excellent at highlighting areas of waste in the public sector, but I think we also have a system, and you touched on this, John, that is sometimes penny wise but pound foolish. And then, as alongside plenty of pointless public sector jobs, there are also extremely important ones, like being an MP, where salaries are just simply not competitive with the private sector. So I think we should be paying fewer people better and have a state that does fewer things better. And I would argue that that's not just a fiscal necessity or an economic necessity, but a moral one too, because I think smaller government means people have greater freedom, choice, and self-determination, and I think that's what we all want to see.
Thank you, Alice. I think for the TPA, a reasonable level of public expenditure for us would be around a third of GDP. £1 for every 3 we raise in the private economy. I think that's kind of our target, which is why we campaign so hard on areas of wasteful spending to make sure that we actually have the money left over for world-class public services, not sort of poor public services that we do have in many cases. But I wanted to put a little point back to you on the triple lock. What would you do instead? Would you just get rid of it, or would you replace it with some sort of double lock, or what kind of mechanism would you put in place instead? Or, as somebody said in this tent earlier, would you abolish the state pension?
Tempting. I mean, I would prefer a much greater contributory system, and people think that the pensions are a kind of fund that they've paid into all their life. That's not how it works at all. And I mean, I think a reasonable change would be to uprate it along with inflation rather than have a triple lock.
Okay. Let's hand over to Ben. Ben, I know Britain Remade have obviously done a lot of work on the nature of public spending in many ways, i.e., focusing on infrastructure and this kind of thing. So, over to you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for having me, John, and thanks to the other panelists. So I work for Britain Remade, which is a policy campaign for economic growth that focuses on building more housing, energy, and transport infrastructure. We've been across the country, from Aberdeen to Anglesey, talking to voters about their opinions. Most of them are tired and stretched by the cost of living crisis. I don't think they care about an ideological debate about small or big state. They just want a state that works and delivers on its promises, that doesn't waste their hard-earned money. One place where we're not getting much value for money is building much-needed transport infrastructure. We've compiled a database of nearly 250 infrastructure projects from Britain and from other Western European countries, from Canada, America, Australia, and the results are not great for the UK. We're spending more on road, rail, trams, and bridges than many other countries, except America, but that's, its own thing. Every British tram project that we looked at is more expensive than every single French tram project. Our underground lines cost 6 times more than the Spanish can build them for. And HS2, the big kind of looming cloud over this event, is 6 times more expensive than an Italian line that was just built, 8 times more expensive than a Japanese line, and a full 10 times more expensive than a recently opened French high-speed line to Bordeaux. So whilst other countries are building growth-inducing transport infrastructure, we're debating whether or not to cut a line between 2 of our biggest cities. Political meddling on this won't help, and it won't help a line that the majority still support. You can just ask the SNP for that. In 2007, for the Scottish elections, the SNP was promising that they would cut the Edinburgh Trams project for fiscal responsibility purposes. And as you know, if you've been up to Edinburgh, the tram was built, and it was built for more than it was budgeted for, and took way longer than expected. And part of that is the political meddling, saying, we'll cut it, we'll delay it because of cost reasons, and yet that just means that the costs go up. And much needed and much loved infrastructure is delayed and more expensive. So we should be focusing on value engineering, not gold-plating tunnels for NIMBYs who still oppose the project, not making it the fastest line in Europe when it's more about building extra capacity for the overstretched West Coast Main Line. And I think the most crazy story I heard was that HS2 is using taxpayer money to rehome badgers, while at the same time, DEFRA is using taxpayer money to cull badgers. It beggars belief. I really think that voters that we spoke to want the government to deliver infrastructure, but they want to deliver on budget and on time. Another good example about delivering value is the decision to remove the ban on onshore wind that was announced last month. Onshore wind projects are massively popular, but up until recently, one objection could scupper an entire field. Rather than spending £28 billion per year that we don't have trying to copy the Americans on the Infrastructure Reduction Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, like Labour want to, removing the ban on onshore wind allows private capital to invest in new green energy. Getting rid of red tape is so key to making the state work better and working with private capital that wants to fund green projects that lower bills. Energy bills are way too high for all of the voters that we've spoken to avoid using one of the cheapest forms of energy. So in the run-up to the next election, we shouldn't be focusing on slashing the state or really driving an ideological quest towards a small state, but we should be focusing on making the state deliver value for taxpayers. This will rebuild trust in the Conservative Party and help hold on to the 2019 coalition that elected the majority. And I think if we can rebuild that trust, we're a good way towards winning the next election.
Thank you, Ben. When the coalition government came in, the split between public spending, George Osborne really sort of took a knife to capital spending and ring-fenced lots of areas of current spending. So a lot of sympathy with what you're saying. But in terms of the ideological argument between a small and a big state and all the rest of it, perhaps voters might not care about it in the abstract. I'm sure that's true. But isn't it up to politicians and people involved in the sort of political scene to lead from the front and make those arguments rather than just sort of be led by focus groups? I was directing it at Ben, but Alex is coming after. He's coming after.
Yeah, I think there's a case to be making these ideological arguments, but I think what voters really care about is having trains that show up on time and reliable, not overcrowded or delayed or cancelled, and they care about energy bills that are cheaper and more affordable. It's not these abstract ideological debates, but it's really reflecting on their take-home income and how far that stretches and how challenged they are. And if a small state provides that, I'm sure they'd be happy. And if a large state provides that, I'm sure they'd also be happy. It's really just about making sure that they feel confident in their economic position and confident that it's going to get better, not that we're heading down a course where things are getting worse.
Okay, but I suppose that's sort of my point. The small versus big state argument, again, it may not matter to them, but if it matters for sound public finances or other reasons, surely it's up to politicians to make that case to them rather than sort of be led by, I want my trains to turn up on time. Of course we want our trains to turn up on time, but the size and shape and nature of the state are important questions, whether or not people necessarily care about them in that abstract.
Yeah, no, they are definitely important questions, but I don't think that they're the most important questions. Okay. We should be asking about how to make the state work better and deliver infrastructure projects cheaper and deliver more homes for people, rather than asking, very interesting philosophical questions, but ones that probably don't appeal to the voters on the doorsteps.
So a focus on outcomes as much as anything else. Okay, Alice, I know you wanted to come in on this.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I feel like that there just isn't the kind of appetite to hear these arguments. I feel like we're in a situation slightly similar to after the Second World War. COVID, I think, has demonstrated to people the kind of, there was a massive expansion of the state. It demonstrated to people that the state can do things. It can do a vaccine rollout. It can lock you in your home. And I think that, much like after the Second World War, we got the Attlee era, because there was demonstrated the power of collective action. I think we're in a similar place now, and I just don't think there's an appetite to hear these arguments. And I think, Conservatives, if they want to reform the state, they need to win elections. They need to, slightly tell people stuff they want to hear or are prepared to hear.
Okay. We're at that point where we're going to open out to the floor now. So I can see a hand that's just gone up there, and there's two more here. So why don't we take those three questions actually in a bunch? Thank you. If you could just say your name beforehand.
Hi, Simon Whiteley from Poplar and Limehouse. I have a question for the Chief Secretary to the Treasury. So this is supposed to be a talk on spending restraint. So what about making some politically popular spending cuts? There are some. We're currently spending 0.5% of GDP on foreign aid, down from 0.7%. Great call by Boris. What about cutting it further? Also, what about stopping spending billions on illegal immigrants, putting them in 3-star hotels? The French government doesn't do that. If we made these cuts, they could be then spent on the priorities of the British people, the NHS, or maybe even tax cuts. John, what are you afraid of? Are you afraid Polly Toynbee is going to give you a hard time over a glass of Prosecco somewhere? I don't get it. We're coming up to an election year. You need to listen. You guys, you need to listen to Tory party members and voters. Otherwise, you're going to lose.
Right. We'll park those two questions. We'll actually let John address that straight away, shall we?
Yeah. I mean, you've also got to listen to Conservative voters and what they want as well. And, of course, the money that we've spent on ODA has gone down from 0.7 to 0.5, and that isn't going to be changed for quite a few years. And, of course, the other bit is we've used the provisions in that to actually spend a considerable portion of that 0.5 to deal with the first year of some of the asylum costs. And in terms of managing down the billions on immigration, absolutely, that's a conversation I have with the Home Secretary very regularly, just a couple of weeks ago. Well, the Home Secretary is responsible for her budget, and I challenge her on managing her budget. And the truth is that this is a very, very challenging area of expenditure, because when you've got people who are actually in the sea, you need to find somewhere them to stay. Now, I think Rob Jenrick's done a brilliant job of actually finding ways of cutting some of those costs, and there is further to go. And that my job is to make departmental spending ministers accountable for their budgets and to get them to find savings. So over the summer, when we agreed all of the pay review body outcomes, I wasn't going to borrow anymore. I said, you do this within your own budgets. That's what they did. It was remarkable how quickly it happened.
Matthew, are there such things as popular spending cuts?
Obviously, almost certainly not. I mean, you mentioned a couple there which might be popular, but they'd be unpopular in other ways. I mean, I think I come back to the point I made earlier, and I think I respect what people like John are saying, that you get demands from Conservative voters, from Conservative backbenchers, and from the electorate more widely. I come back to the point I made earlier, which is you need to change the terms of the argument, and you need to start making the argument more effectively. And even just to come back, a little bit to what Alice was saying, it's not just about winning elections. And I think, when John says obviously things like the triple lock, you won the last election. It was in the manifesto having the triple lock. So you can't change it now. I mean, that would be a betrayal of what you stood for in the election. But you're coming up to a new election and a new manifesto quite soon. So you're going to have to make a decision about whether you put that in. Yeah. And I think maybe when it comes up to the election, I do think the party should make some harder choices, which is say we've got to do what we believe in as Conservatives and what we believe is right for the country. Heck, it might lose us the election. It's not the end of the world. The world keeps turning. Maybe we'll win an election in 5 years' time. But you've got to start winning the argument and having an electorate which has actually voted for a slightly smaller state, for a slightly reorganised state, and for slightly different spending priorities.
John, you were shaking your head.
Well, I mean, there's hardly any point being sort of ideologically right and pure and losing an election. What you've got to do is have the courage to put to the electorate a set of choices, justify them, and win an election.
Well, also, but
and I think that's absolutely what we're trying to do. But it has to be realistic too, because as I said to you, there's so much emphasis always on tax cuts, but not on spending restraint. And I just wanted to pick up on something Alice said, because I'm very sympathetic on 2-year-olds not having literacy targets, but actually in the evidence from the consultation on reducing some of the ratios, for example, on childcare, 96% of people didn't want them changed. So, you can have an ideological view of deregulate and then find that 96% of the population that you're trying to provide with that service doesn't want it. Now, you can advocate for it and you can bring choice so that some wouldn't choose it and show that it's not the catastrophe that they may. And, of course, in Scotland, they've got the different ratios. So, that's, of course, the challenge that we've got to have. Give people choice and allow that to reform the services that we have. And, in terms of the childcare policy more broadly, I mean, obviously we work very hard with the OBR to have it scored. So it doesn't cost half as much as what it would have cost, because we actually see the 110,000 jobs that people entering the workforce consequential of that intervention. But I totally accept that where we are compared to other countries who spend vastly more on it is very different. Now, there's certainly a relationship to productivity, but that needs to be right. What other things don't we do in other parts of government that allow that to be spent? Because you've got to have those matching savings, if otherwise the state will grow. Something that I think the subject of this evening's conversation is we want to avoid that.
I'm going to say on the ratios, I mean, lots of other countries have much higher ratios, and it's not like people thinking that kids in France or Spain are in dangerously unsafe nurseries. I just think it's a question of making the argument to people, because of course they're worried about their children's safety, but actually I think that's a completely spurious argument. And I think that because the costs are so high, it means so many families just can't afford formal childcare at all. So I think it's about making the case that this is about having, as you say, much more choice, much more freedom, doing much more on childminders, for instance. I know you are doing something on that. And just on the idea of popular spending, because I would just say in the government's defence on the immigrant hotels, the reason why France doesn't spend money on this because it has a lawless jungle camp on its border. I don't think we would want to recreate that here. I think we need to get the. I mean, there might maybe some cost savings to be made there, but I don't think just letting them sort of roam the shores is an alternative proposition.
Okay, let's open out for some more questions. We've got two gentlemen at the front here. One just front row, and then one just behind.
Thank you very much. I'm from the United States. My accent wasn't a dead giveaway. I'm a member of Conservatives Abroad. First conference, wonderful to be here. Question is, would you be in favor of maybe doing, like in the United States have proposed, a regulatory freedom aspect, essentially for every new regulation that's proposed to come off the list? Because if you make that commitment and you were to have MPs commit to doing that, I think that might be a more successful gambit than, having differing proposals come through and trying to, sort of distill it down into something that's, I think, a more viable electoral aspect, maybe.
Thank you. Ivan Murray-Smith, a Conservative for Great Yarmouth Borough Council. My question is this. We've heard a lot about tax cuts and stimulating growth. Employers' national insurance, as opposed to employees' national insurance, is basically a tax on jobs. So if we want to stimulate growth, would employers' national insurance not be an obvious target to try and drive productivity? Thank you.
John, why don't you pick up on one
Both,
and two out?
yeah. I mean, on
Both,
on the first one, I wouldn't want to be constrained. I mean, I've been involved in politics for a little while. I was director of the Conservative Research Department when we were in opposition, and I've seen lots of things where we've said, you know, 2 out, 1 in, or 1 in, 2 out, and all these things. I wouldn't want to be constrained. What I want is to see the cabinet ministers owning their budgets, defining the outcomes, and holding director generals accountable for the delivery of the programs of work and the legislation needed. And you know, I think we've gone through a tendency over the last generation to have, you know, another arm's length body set up, another quango, which then develops its own existence, its own identity, its own accountability to no one other than itself. And of course there are a few exceptions, but we've got to normalise a situation where politicians take responsibility for their budgets and the outcomes with it, and all the tentacles that come out of government departments. And I think if we learn anything from what happened from the Brexit vote, it was that people are frustrated with the sense that government can't be gripped. It's got to be gripped. To the point about tax on jobs, look, there's lots of, you know, an hour doesn't go by where I don't get lobbied on one tax or another that has an impact on employment and enterprise and so on. And at the end of the day, we will look at all of these things in the round when it comes to fiscal events, and we must create the optimal conditions for delivering quality public services people expect in the run-up to an election, but also setting the optimal conditions for high productivity growth after we've dealt with inflation. That is absolutely my imperative, and you know, I'm committed to doing everything I can to present the Chancellor and the Prime Minister with the options to deliver that.
Yeah, I think with the 1 in, 2 out exercise that was introduced under the coalition government, there sort of seemed to be a sense that a really important and possibly even burdensome regulation would come in, but you know, I've got to find 2 regulations to get rid of, so they just find 2 that are redundant anyway and don't actually impact on any business or the economy. So it becomes a bit of a headline chasing thing as opposed to a substantive.
Well, yeah, I think that is the risk. Yeah. We don't want headlines driving it. We want a principled argument about what sort of government service do we want and what it takes to deliver it. And my instinct is that we have got to be more on it in terms of understanding the detail rather than chasing a media headline.
Matthew, employers' national insurance. Priority tax, or is there something else that we should be looking at?
Yeah, I was just going to say, as the only journalist on the panel, I'm quite in favour of headlines. So I'm not. I was
sure.
going to put up a small.
I've read some of your articles. I can see that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Just getting back to John's question. Yeah. I mean, I think employers' national insurance is an important tax. I mean, it's a variant on your tax earlier of which tax cuts you would prioritise. And we're not. You know, the first thing to say is we're not in a situation, despite John's best efforts, where there's probably much room for any kind of tax cuts, which is unfortunate. So it's, you know, we need to talk about how we get into the space where we can tax, you know, cut some taxes. So, but even, you know, if we are in the space where we can cut some taxes, I actually think in business taxation, employers' national insurance would be a great one to cut. But I think the corporation tax. Reversing the corporation tax cut is going to be the priority. I think, you know, I totally respect what John says, but I think it's going to prove a mistake, and I think that will become increasingly clear over the next 2 or 3 years. So I think we should reverse that before we look at anything else. But the big thing is actually to win the argument and actually create the space where we can trim some public spending and we can free up some space for tax cuts.
Ben, just to develop the question on regulations, regardless of 1 in, 2 out, presumably a lot of your work is focused specifically on regulations and the things that hold back some big infrastructure projects and make them more expensive.
Yeah, no, that's definitely true. I mean, the planning system for large infrastructure projects is riddled with examples where we're forcing projects to go out to many, many rounds of consultation to make sure that they get exactly right so that they're not judicial reviewed. And yet they somehow always manage to be judicial reviewed, delaying the projects for a year while people who are ready to work, ready to start building much needed infrastructure wait. The planning application for the Lower Thames crossing that connects Kent and Essex cost more than £250 million, which for that same amount of money, Norway built the longest road tunnel in the world. It was 15 miles long. And they built the deepest road tunnel in the world at the same time. It's such a load of expense that goes into fulfilling effectively one government department asking another government department, can we build this much needed road? I'm sure we could simplify it a little bit, which would allow much needed infrastructure to get built and growth to result from that.
John, you were very...
Yeah, well, I can say something on this. I'm recused in the Treasury, so I can say it anyway. Like, I represent Salisbury. We've got the Stonehenge Tunnel. December 14, David Cameron and Nick Clegg came down and said we're going to have a tunnel. And it's nearly 9 years since that happened. And I haven't seen that tunnel. And I know I asked them why this is taken so long, and you're absolutely right, Ben. There are sort of delays in certainty around whether you're going to do it on balance sheet, off balance sheet, the threat of judicial review. At the core of it, though, is this: there is a failure to make a distinction between, a different truncated planning regime for critical infrastructure. And what we expect needs to happen in other sort of domestic settings. But I think we have got to look at this very, very seriously. I think it's an area that people expect reform. We as a party have also got to come to terms with what it means when we're going to potentially overrule some of the individual views that aren't representative of what's needed for the economy or even a local economy, that is actually stopping things from happening. It causes enormous frustration. It's not good for the economy. But equally, we can't be reckless with the environment. We've got to get that balance right, because actually it is important with the electorate. And we as a party have gone down a long way with neighbourhood plans, etc. But we also need to build houses. We also need to build infrastructure. And as the Prime Minister set out in terms of our energy infrastructure, getting renewables onto the national grid, making sure that we've got the capacity to drive the growth that we're all looking for. And that means some trade-offs. It means being honest that we can't do everything simultaneously, and there are some tough choices. And I agree with you that in other countries that there is a willingness to grasp that from the centre or from somewhere to make it happen. And I think this is something that we need to grip very urgently in this country.
Okay, let's open up for some more questions. This gentleman in the second row, and then Elliot just behind, and then one at the back as well.
Hi all, thank you so much for the very insightful panel. My question to you is, are we a nanny state right now, and do we need to do something radical to change that?
Let's grab that question just behind.
Hi, Elliot Kirk, and I'll declare my interest. I work for the Taxpayers Alliance. At the TPA, we found that in 2022-23, exit payments for civil servants cost £182 million. Would it not be quite a politically popular and also very easy spending restraint to restrict exit payments to £95,000? John, I know it is something that your team have briefed that you're looking at, but is that not something that needs to be accelerated given the...
Yeah, very happy to answer that.
We're going to take one more just to bunch them up. You're lined up for, quite fired up for both of them, but let's see what this third question is.
Hello, I'm James. John, it was interesting you mentioned about Cabinet colleagues always asking for more cash on these new projects. But they're probably advised by senior civil servants who are asking for this money. Yeah. There's also talk as well of... on the panel tonight of public sector workers not being paid enough. I was just thinking, what does the panel believe when it comes to a potential idea of giving out bonuses for cost-saving measures for these senior civil servants?
All right, okay, John, so we've
Yeah.
got nanny state, exit payments, and changing the incentives for public servants.
I think we've got to be clear about what we think the state is for, what support we should give it. When I came in UMP in 2010, we had changes to the Personal Independence Plan, PIP, and the idea was it would give a personalised mechanism to help people into employment when they had disability. That has grown. Now, it's grown by stealth, not necessarily by clear decisions. It's grown by court judgments and so on, and we're in a place where I don't think we intended to be. You know, I believe in a state that's compassionate, that looks after the vulnerable efficiently and properly. I believe in a welfare system that looks after people when they're genuinely vulnerable. But I don't believe it should encourage people to leave the workforce or to avoid the difficult journey back to the workforce. And that's why you've seen Mel Stride introduce measures to do that. But I do think generally we as a culture and as a society are not clear enough about the risks that exist. And I draw from my experience in financial services, where I saw a situation where, people want the FCA to take on almost responsibility as an insurance product for when they make investments at risk. We can't have that, and we've got to be honest with the country about that, and we've got to develop regimes that are realistic and actually aren't trying to insulate everyone from every risk that happens. Yes, on exit payments, I'm very exercised on that. It's something I'm working on. But of course, again, it's not about a single figure that seems politically attractive to put on the Taxpayer Alliance website. It's about the interaction with the reality of historic contractual obligations. If somebody's been employed for 25, 30 years and you want to get rid of them through performance or otherwise, and their contract says X or Y, and it implies more than 95,000, and there is no easy legal way around that, that is the reality. You can't have pure ideology. You've got to have practical measures that work with some of those legacy regimes. But I am working on it. You're absolutely right. It's something that would be attractive and is the right thing to do. And to the question behind about bonuses in the public sector and so on, we need to find creative ways of incentivizing the right behaviors. But we don't want bonuses as default for everyone, and it just becomes a question of how much. We want to make that relationship with outcomes and performance very different, so that actually people, if they're actually running a job centre that gets more people back into work than it ever did before, that team is rewarded. Now, of course, this will mean significant cultural shift in some areas of the public sector. But these are the sorts of things that we must and should look at, because it's not my money, it's the taxpayers' money that I'm a steward of and am responsible and accountable for. And so, I'm not saying when, but we ought to be open to do things differently, because we can't just have a certain number of additional people at a certain grade doing a job for 2 years and then moving on to another grade. That's not the way to do it, and it's not what I want to see going forward.
John, just to pick something up on the exit payments, it wasn't a number that the TPA made up. It was in the Enterprise Act 2016. 95,000 was the figure that the government passed legislation on. It's not something that...
But when you actually then look at the reality, when you see in some people's contracts in terms of their accumulated benefits, that's not always the case. So, I'm doing everything I can to meet those obligations. Mm-hmm. But what I'm just trying to say is, sometimes delivering it at 100% for everyone, or not being a little bit flexible to raise it a little bit further so we can capture more people. And I also don't want to create a situation where every Secretary of State deals with 200 to 300 cases every year to sign them off. I don't want to create more bureaucracy for more civil servants.
Okay. Alice, do we live in a nanny state, and does it make our life more expensive?
I think, I think the biggest example of nanny state or state overreach was obviously the lockdowns. It was, locking young people who weren't at risk of the virus in their homes. And I think it's created this idea that the state can protect you or insulate you from all risks, which is not, I don't think, the job of the state. I think the job of the state is to provide public services. And So yes, I think in that respect we do have a nanny state, and I think there are plenty of examples of nanny state policies which do make costs for consumers far more expensive, on sugar taxes, on alcohol duties, and restrictions on vaping products, for example, which are actually healthier than tobacco. So I think there are plenty of examples of nanny statism that make our lives more expensive. And I think that the lockdowns were a huge example of state overreach.
Ben, in terms of getting infrastructure delivered, should we pay civil servants more to drive through the mess?
I think it's definitely an interesting idea, and one that should be considered, because right now, oftentimes on large infrastructure projects, we don't build enough regularly, so civil servants don't have experience managing large infrastructure projects, so they don't know the ins and the outs of the contract, and they're incentivized for their career to continue to move around rather than to sit on one infrastructure project and become an expert in it. So a bonus system for delivering cost savings could be an interesting idea to try to incentivize civil servants to get into the weeds of the detail of the contracts that they're supposedly managing, and to try to drive cost savings and keep contractors in check when cost overruns are reached.
Matthew, what do you think? A civil servant finds a saving of £1 million in a budget, and they get a percentage up to a maximum in order to help them incentivize them to sort of drive those savings.
I think it'd be great if it worked. I mean, John could probably tell us if it could work or could have a try. I'd be, if as I said, if it worked, it'd be terrific. I'd be a little suspicious. I think one of the problems this government has had in the last 13 years, the Conservative government has had, is just is the institutional opposition within the civil service, and it's always been a problem. You just go back in the history books; it's always been a problem. But I do think it's probably got worse. And people like John, who've been in government, and many of his colleagues could talk more eloquently about that than I could. And if we'll see what happens in the election next year. If the party is in opposition for 5 years or so after the election, which it might be, I think one of the things it's going to have to reflect upon is actually as a more kind of deep-seated and radical approach of reform for its next time in government is a more deep-seated reform of the civil service. So you actually have people, when you have a Conservative government, that it's manned at a senior level, as it is in many other countries, by people who actually believe in the programme. And rather than bonuses, bonuses would be great, but if you fundamentally don't believe in something, a bonus isn't going to make much difference. You actually need people who believe in the programme, and then maybe they get a bonus as well to come into the office at 7 rather than 8. But you need to have that fundamental belief across the top level of the civil service. But that's not something you can do in the next year. That's going to take a lot of preparation. That would be a huge change.
Thank you, Matthew. We're going to have one bonus question, as long as it's very short and brief, and this gentleman's hand's gone up.
Yes, the comments on the lockdowns. Should the Conservative government actually apologise for the lockdowns and for the extreme measures that were brought in to try and deal with COVID, which in many ways turned out the actual so-called solution was almost worse than the disease itself. So I was wondering if we should actually apologise for that, bearing in mind the last... Point taken.
Alice, why don't you pick that up?
I mean, I don't think we're going to see an apology from the government. I feel like it would be a bit like, when people apologise for slavery, or when Nicola Sturgeon apologised for the witch trials, whatever. But I do think, but I do think that we're going to be living with the consequences of those lockdowns for generations to come. I mean, the state of our education system, the suffering of children and young people, is going to affect this country for decades to come. And I think we're all going to be feeling very sorry for those effects of lockdown in the future.
Oh, well,
Dramatic.
I'll tell you what, on that sort of gloomy note, what we'll do is we'll say thank you to... This actually wraps up Think Tent for the year, so thank you so much for all of you for attending in such great numbers throughout the week. Thank you too to the staff at the TPA and the IEA for the hard work in putting it on, and also to the staff at Manchester Central on sound and on catering for all of your hard work during the week as well. So very much appreciated. But if you could join me in thanking the panel in a usual way.